Every morning for a week, Josiah Prentice backed his sump pump to Blackmere Pond while the village of Larkspur chuckled. They called it a fool's errand, draining a 2-acre stain that never bred anything but mosquitoes. But on the 6th morning, as the mud peeled back like a slow curtain, a riveted steel crate broke the surface. It had been buried down there before anyone alive could recall. Inside lay a pre-war prototype nobody knew existed, perfectly preserved and worth over $2 million. Josiah Prentice wasn't chasing a wild idea. He'd spent a career as an estate liquidator, trained to read what old houses bury. And he had a single clue, a mark on a survey from his grandmother, a story of something lost before the pond rose. When the village laughed, he heard the thing nobody else did, a secret the mud had been keeping for a century. Blackmere Pond had sat on the Prentice family land since before the Civil War. It was 2 acres of still, tea-colored water that never seemed to deepen or recede. Kids imagined it was bottomless. Grown-ups only ever saw it as a breeding ground for mosquitoes and a waste of good grazing land. Nobody in Larkspur could remember a time when it wasn't there. Nobody, that is, except an old woman who'd whispered scraps of family history to her grandson before he could barely walk. That grandson was Josiah Prentice. By the time he was 67, he'd spent 4 decades unraveling the secrets of dead people's belongings. As an estate liquidator, he'd learned that what families threw away often held more truth than what they kept. He'd found cash in false bottom drawers, love letters in floorboards, and once, a payroll chest from the 1880s under a pile of wet insulation. He trusted his nose for buried things, and Blackmere had always bothered him. Not because of the smell, though that was real, but because of a single sentence on an 1892 survey he'd found in a county archive. The line, smudged and barely legible, described a carriage shed standing at the pond's edge, with a notation that the pond's level had been raised artificially sometime after the turn of the century. His grandmother had called that pond a grave for something her own father should never have buried. She never said what, and he never forgot. When Josiah finally announced he was draining Blackmere, he might as well have declared he was digging for pirate gold. The regulars at the hardware store laughed over their coffee. "That old fool's gonna find nothing but catfish and mud," someone said within earshot of his nephew. At church on Sunday, a well-meaning deacon offered to pray for his discernment. The worst of it came from his own brother, Silas, who hadn't spoken to him in years over a land dispute, and now used the pond plan to remind everyone how Josiah had always been the dreamy one, chasing shadows while sensible folks got work done. None of that mattered on the morning in late April when a flatbed truck backed a rented sump pump down the overgrown bank. Josiah booted his waders through a switch, and a hose the thickness of a man's thigh began belching dark water into the drainage ditch by the road. The level fell slowly at first, a few inches in a week, but as the water shrank, the mud crept outward from the bank like a slimy tide going the wrong way. Passing cars began to slow. Kids on bicycles stopped to stare at the old man standing alone beside his pump, watching the water fall with a patience their parents didn't possess. Then on the 6th morning something changed. The water had dropped nearly 8 feet, exposing a shelf of black muck that had never seen sunlight. And in that muck, just where the old survey said the shed should have been, a shape began to emerge. Not a stump, not a rock, a sharp corner of metal, clean and straight, catching the sunrise. The laughter up the road went quiet, but that was only the beginning of what Josiah Prentice would pull from the mud. What sat inside that sealed box would do more than silence a village. It would rewrite a little corner of automobile history and put a price tag on a secret that had been waiting 100 years to be found. Josiah didn't sleep the night after the metal corner broke the surface. He sat in the cab of his pickup with a thermos of coffee and a flashlight, watching the water fall inch by stubborn inch while the rest of Larkspur dreamed. By noon the next day, the pump had drawn down enough for him to wade in, knee-deep in sucking black mud that tried to steal his boots with every step. The object he'd struck wasn't a corner. It was the top edge of a steel crate, sealed along every seam with welding that had held for a century. The entire thing measured nearly 14 feet long and 5 feet wide, buried upright on a slight angle as though someone had lowered it into the pond before the water ever rose. Josiah ran his hand over the rivets and felt his pulse in his ears. He'd seen military footlockers, bank deposit boxes, even a sealed wine cellar. He had never seen anything like this. It took a borrowed backhoe, a set of heavy chains, and 2 full days of digging around the perimeter before the crate finally pulled free with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. The mud released it with a long, sucking sigh, and the machine dragged it onto dry pasture while every farmer within radio distance found an excuse to drive past. Sela's Prentice, Josiah's estranged brother, was among them. He stood at the fence line with his arms folded, saying nothing, watching. Now came the harder question. What was inside? The welds were thick and deliberate. Josiah had to grind them down by hand, a process that took another day and drew a small crowd. The hardware store ran out of grinding wheels, and the owner later told people he'd never sold that many in 1 week. When the final weld cracked, Josiah pried the lid back with a crowbar, and the smell that rose was not rot or rust. It was oil. Old oil, machine oil, mixed with the dry, woody scent of leather and ancient paper. Inside, packed in layers of oiled canvas and straw that had done its work perfectly, lay the most complete collection of pre-war automobilia anyone in the room had ever seen. There were factory manuals printed on vellum paper, their pages still crisp and white. Leather-bound sales brochures with hand-tinted photographs of cars nobody had driven in 100 years. Brass headlamps, still wrapped in original tissue. A crate of spark plugs, each one polished like jewelry. And underneath it all, suspended on a wooden cradle that kept it from touching the steel floor, sat an automobile chassis unlike anything the men gathered around that pasture had ever laid eyes on. It was long, low, and impossibly elegant, with a brass radiator shell shaped like a ship's prow and a wheelbase that suggested a car built for royalty. The engine block was cast iron, massive, with overhead valves, rare for its era, and a serial number stamped clean and deep. The frame rails were still painted, the brass trim still gleaming where the straw had lifted away. It was a chassis without a body, but only barely. The steering wheel sat in place, the dash panel with its instruments intact. Whoever buried this had intended for it to survive. Word reached the nearest vintage automobile club within hours. By the weekend, a forensic appraiser named Leonard Cross, an authority on pre-WWI American luxury cars, drove 500 miles from Pennsylvania just to see the crate with his own eyes. He had spent his career tracking down cars that history forgot. When he knelt beside the chassis and tilted his flashlight over the serial number, his hands began to shake. What Josiah had pulled from the mud was a lost treasure of American motoring. Cross identified the chassis as a 1914 Lozier Model 90 Phaeton Speedster prototype, one of 3 ever built. Lozier was the most expensive American automobile of its day, costing more than a new house, and the Model 90 was supposed to be its crowning achievement. The prototype debuted at the Chicago Auto Show in January 1914, drew crowds and newspaper headlines, and then vanished. All 3 were believed scrapped or destroyed in the chaos of the First World War. No known example had ever survived. Until now, Cross's preliminary valuation, conservative and carefully worded, landed at $2.1 million, and that was for the chassis alone, without the automobilia, without the factory documents. The collection as a whole, he said, might exceed $3 million at auction. The number punched a hole through the midday quiet. The same neighbors who had laughed at Josiah's fool's errand now stood mute in the pasture, the weight of their jokes settling into something closer to shame. The transformation was instantaneous. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "The Joke That Became a Fortune." The hardware store owner who had sold Josiah the grinding wheels suddenly remembered him as a sharp-eyed fellow. The deacon who had offered prayers for discernment told the congregation that God's timing was mysterious. Even Silas, who hadn't spoken to his brother in years, showed up at the farmhouse door with a bottle of whiskey and an expression Josiah couldn't quite read. But buried treasure has a way of bringing old disputes to the surface. And a single sentence on that 1892 survey, a property line notation that nobody had ever cared about before, was about to turn Josiah's miracle into a courtroom drama that would test everything he believed about his family, his land, and whether a man can ever truly own what he pulls from the dirt of his own backyard. The sentence on the survey was barely legible, just 6 words in faded ink. Pond tract subject to partition agreement. For 130 years, nobody in the Prentice family had given it a second thought. The pond sat on Josiah's land, just as it had sat on his father's land and his grandfather's before him. But buried treasure has a way of unearthing old paper. And Silas Prentice, the brother who hadn't spoken to Josiah in 8 years, had hired a title lawyer before the backhoe had even cooled down. 3 days after the crate was dragged into the sunlight, Silas showed up at the farmhouse not with a bottle of whiskey, but with a thick manila envelope. Inside was a copy of a 1902 deed, never recorded in the county courthouse but found in a safety deposit box their mother had kept until her death. The deed described a division of the family acreage between 2 great uncles, a split that left the southern half of Blackmere Pond, the exact half from which Josiah had pulled the crate, on a separate parcel that had passed, through a tangled chain of inheritance, directly to Silas. The pond had always been treated as one piece. The families had farmed around it for generations without a fence. But on paper, the water had never belonged to Josiah alone. And what lay beneath it, Silas argued, belonged to them both. Josiah stood in his kitchen and read the document twice. His hands were steady, but his voice came out thin. He told Silas they could work something out, that family shouldn't fight over something neither of them had earned. Silas said nothing for a long moment. Then he told Josiah what he wanted, half of everything. Not just the chassis and the automobilia, but half the land, half the mineral rights, half of any future value the pond might hold. He'd already had the entire site surveyed by a firm from Albany. He'd already filed a notice of claim with the county. The brother who had called Josiah a dreamer his whole life had moved faster than anyone could believe. The lawsuit landed the following Monday. Silas Prentice versus Josiah Prentice, filing number 2047, Dutchess County Superior Court. By the time the local paper got hold of it, the story had transformed from a heartwarming discovery into a bitter inheritance feud. The hardware store regulars, who had so recently praised Josiah's sharp eye, suddenly found new doubts. Maybe the old man had known about the treasure all along. Maybe that was why he drained the pond in the first place. The speculation spread like a stain. People who couldn't read a property deed suddenly had strong opinions about survey lines and easements. The legal battle took over Josiah's life. What started as a quiet retirement project became a war fought in depositions, land records, and dusty probate files. Both brothers hired historians to trace the chain of ownership back to the 1850s. The crate, meanwhile, sat in a climate-controlled storage unit in Poughkeepsie under a court seal, its value frozen while lawyers argued about who had the right to touch it. The auction house that had been preparing a catalog pulled back, unwilling to move forward with clouded title. Appraisers who had once called the chassis priceless now used words like encumbered and unmarketable. Josiah, the man who had pulled a lost Lozier from the mud with his own hands, could not even visit it without permission from a judge. And then the truth got darker. While digging through archives for the lawsuit, a researcher hired by Josiah's legal team stumbled onto something no one had expected to find. The great-uncle who had owned the property in the early 1900s, a man named Theodore Prentice, had not been a farmer or a collector. He had been the Eastern sales manager for Lozier Motors, and he had been indicted in 1913 on charges of embezzling company funds. The indictment alleged that Theodore had diverted a company automobile, a prototype meant for the Chicago Auto Show, into his private possession and then falsified records to show it had been destroyed in transport. The car disappeared, Theodore invoked the Fifth Amendment, and the case collapsed for lack of physical evidence. The chassis at the bottom of Blackmere Pond wasn't just a lost treasure. It was the smoking gun in a 110-year-old crime. That revelation changed everything in the courtroom. If the chassis had been stolen from Lozier Motors, then it never legally belonged to Theodore Prentice in the first place. It couldn't be inherited. It couldn't be divided. It belonged, potentially, to the corporate successor of a company that had gone bankrupt in 1920. The judge ordered all proceedings halted while the parties untangled a property claim that now stretched across 3 centuries. Josiah sat in the gallery, staring at the back of his brother's head, wondering if the pond had been cursed from the start. But hidden among the old court files, folded into the back of Theodore's indictment papers, was a single yellowed sheet in handwriting no one had yet bothered to examine. It was a letter from Theodore to his wife, written the night before his arrest, instructing her to bury everything on the property and to leave a note for whoever found it. The note itself had rotted away decades ago, but the letter stated plainly that whatever was found belonged to the descendant who finally looked where others refused to look. Not to the landowner, not to the estate, to the finder, by name, if the finder was of Prentice blood. And the name he had written with a confidence that crossed a century was Josiah. But beyond the fortune and the headlines, there's a quieter truth buried in the mud of Blackmere Pond. Most of us spend our lives driving past the ponds in our own world, the overlooked ideas, the neglected corners, the stories that seem too far gone to save. Josiah Prentice didn't find a chassis. He found proof that the thing everyone dismisses is sometimes the only thing worth holding onto. The treasure wasn't just the Lozier. It was the decades he spent learning to trust the quiet instinct that most people drown out with common sense. If this story reminded you that the most valuable things are often hidden in plain sight, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about something you've been told to ignore that you just can't shake. Share this with someone who needs permission to go after what everyone else has already written off. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching tonight.